He had everything money could buy: mansions, cars, vacations, status. Yet inside, Ethan Coleman felt empty. The son of a millionaire from Beverly Hills, heir to a fortune that seemed endless, failed at everything he tried, in business, in love, and in being someone real. Until one day, a humble black maid with calm eyes and a mysterious past entered his life and taught him a secret no professor, no investor, and not even his own father had ever revealed. A secret you won't find in Harvard or in any bank account: the power of humility. And what happened next will surprise you. This story is about failure, forgiveness, and rebirth, about how an invisible woman changed the heart of a man who had everything except purpose. So go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story that might change your life. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Let's see how far Ruth Harris's voice and her legacy can travel. Ethan Coleman lived surrounded by luxury, yet carried inside him a void that money could never fill. As the son of a stern millionaire, he had learned early on that failure was a sin, and that love came with a price. The mansion in Beverly Hills was both his castle and his prison. Every marble wall reflected not only his wealth but his loneliness. The young heir was surrounded by everything except peace. Richard Coleman, his father, was a man who breathed power. To him, success was an obligation and emotion was weakness. Ethan grew up trying to reach an impossible standard, believing he would only be worthy once he proved he was better than everyone else. But the harder he tried, the more he lost himself. Even as a millionaire, he felt small beneath his own shadow. No prize, no high grade, no praise ever seemed enough. The Coleman house ran like a corporation: strict schedules, unquestionable rules, cold discipline. There was no room for laughter or hugs, and only goals and expectations. Among the staff, no one dared meet Richard's piercing eyes, until Ruth Harris arrived, a calm, composed cleaning lady dressed in a neat green uniform and quiet shoes. Her presence seemed to soften that rigid atmosphere. Ruth didn't speak much, but she observed everything. As she wiped the marble floors, she could feel the tension hanging around the millionaire's son. He paced restlessly, like someone wrestling with an invisible enemy. There was pride in his posture, but also exhaustion. Ruth saw what others ignored. Behind Ethan's arrogance was a weary heart, suffocated by the pressure to be perfect. Then, one ordinary day, everything collapsed. Ethan had failed another test at his father's company. Rage consumed him. He shouted, threw papers across the room, and in a burst of frustration, humiliated Ruth in front of everyone. The once busy hall fell silent. Ruth simply lowered her gaze, picked up the scattered pages, and quietly went back to work, without a word of protest. What disturbed Ethan most wasn't the failure itself, but her reaction. No anger, no resentment, just calm dignity. Somehow, she seemed to understand the pain hidden behind his outburst. That silence cut deeper than any scolding from his father. For the first time, Ethan felt shame. Not for his mistakes, but for how he had treated someone who was only doing her job. From that moment on, something began to shift. The millionaire, used to applause and privilege, found himself face to face with his own humanity. Ruth, without meaning to, had planted a seed inside him. The way she handled humiliation, and with quiet strength, stirred a curiosity he couldn't ignore. Who was this woman who didn't flinch under the contempt of the rich? In the following days, silence became his teacher. Ethan tried to go back to routine, but the memory of that scene haunted him. Each time he saw Ruth sweeping the floor, he remembered his arrogance. The mansion that once symbolized power now felt smaller. Slowly, he began to realize that true strength might not come from money, but from something Ruth carried: a quiet wisdom, an unshakable peace. One night, as he wandered through the silent corridors, a soft sound reached his ears. A woman's voice was singing an old lullaby, gentle and haunting. Ethan froze. He recognized that melody instantly. It was the same song his mother used to sing before he fell asleep. And now it was coming from the lips of the cleaning lady he had once humiliated. The next morning, the mansion still carried the echo of the previous day's outburst. Ethan Coleman, the young millionaire, avoided meeting the eyes of the staff. Every hallway seemed to remind him of the humiliation he had caused. And yet the only person he wanted and feared to see was Ruth Harris, the maid who had witnessed his worst side without losing her composure. There was something in her calm that unsettled him, as if she could see straight through him. Ruth continued her work as if nothing had happened. She wiped the floors, gathered the cups, adjusted the curtains, all with her usual steady rhythm. But there was a subtle difference. Her gaze lingered longer, her movements were slower, more deliberate. She didn't judge him. She simply saw him, and that lack of judgment hurt more than any reprimand. Ethan sensed something strange about this simple woman, something that made him feel small in her presence. He tried to distract himself with company reports, but Ruth's words kept echoing in his mind. Sometimes what looks like failure is just a cry for help. The phrase sounded like a sentence he couldn't fully understand. He was used to orders, not wisdom. For the first time, the millionaire faced a truth money couldn't buy, that maybe his arrogance was just fear in disguise. At dinner, Richard Coleman spoke about investments and partnerships, never noticing his son's silence. Ethan listened as his father lectured about power and success, but his thoughts wandered back to the maid's steady eyes. The contrast was impossible to ignore. A father who measured worth in profits and a woman who seemed to measure life in small acts of grace. That night, Ethan realized how tired he was of pretending. Later, when the house fell silent, Ethan went downstairs for air. Then he heard it, a soft, feminine voice singing an old song, something between sorrow and tenderness. He followed the sound down the service corridor and found Ruth alone, cleaning the floor while she sang. The melody felt familiar, but he couldn't place it, until a chill ran through him. It was the same lullaby his mother used to sing to him before bed. He froze behind the wall, listening. Each note pulled him back to childhood, to gentle hands that rocked him, to the sweet scent time had erased. The millionaire, once so proud, now felt a lump in his throat. Ruth, unaware she was being watched, kept singing. Her voice was calm and steady, filling the cold house with warmth. In that moment, the mansion wasn't silent anymore, it was alive. He stepped forward without thinking. When Ruth saw him, she didn't flinch. She simply smiled, with the serenity of someone who understood what words couldn't express. Ethan's voice trembled as he asked, "How do you know that song?" Ruth hesitated, eyes glistening, and replied softly, "Some promises last longer than life itself." Her answer hit him like thunder. The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Ethan stepped back, unsure what to feel, trying to make sense of her words. Curiosity now burned inside him like a flame. The maid knew something he didn't, and that truth disturbed him more than any failure, more than his father's contempt. For the first time, he wanted to understand rather than defend himself. As he climbed the stairs, the melody lingered behind him. The sound was soft yet haunting, as if it whispered his name. Ethan knew in that moment that nothing would ever be the same. The song from his childhood had returned, carrying with it the questions time had buried. Ruth Harris, the invisible woman of the house, had just become the bridge between his past and what was yet to come. Ethan Coleman didn't sleep that night. The melody kept echoing inside him, each note unlocking a drawer of forgotten memories. By morning, the millionaire came down the stairs, weary but determined to confront the woman who somehow carried his mother's voice. Ruth Harris, the maid, was calmly cleaning the grand hall, the same place where she had been humiliated days earlier. When she saw him, she simply stopped what she was doing and waited in silence. "How do you know that song?" Ethan asked, his voice sharp and uncertain. Ruth looked at him with serenity, as if she knew the time had come to fulfill an old promise. "Because she asked me to," she said quietly. Ethan frowned. "Who did?" Ruth took a slow breath before saying the name he hadn't heard in years. "Your mother, Laura Coleman." Time seemed to freeze in that moment. Ethan stepped back, disbelief washing over his face. His heart, used to the coldness of business and pressure, now beat with the pulse of a living memory. "You knew my mother?" he whispered. Ruth nodded gently, her eyes glistening. "I took care of her in her final months. I was with her until the end." The words landed softly, yet deeply, cutting through layers of pride that had never been touched before. The room fell silent. Outside, sunlight streamed through the tall windows, turning floating dust into golden particles. Ethan stared at the maid, trying to piece together the fragments of a past he'd never understood. He remembered his mother's tenderness, the scent of jasmine, and the lullaby that now haunted him. Ruth stood still, hands clasped, her gaze steady and full of quiet strength. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Because your father didn't want you to know," Ruth replied without flinching. "I promised her I would protect you, even if it meant staying silent." For a second, Ethan felt the ground give way beneath him. The simple woman he had once dismissed had been the guardian of the love time had tried to erase. The millionaire sat on the couch, completely undone. For the first time, there were no masks, no posture of a wealthy heir, just a son facing a memory come back to life. Ruth slowly walked closer and rested her hand on his shoulder, a simple gesture, yet full of meaning. "Your mother believed in you, Ethan," she said softly. "She always said her heart would live on through you." Her voice carried the calm of truth. Ruth told him how Laura would spend her nights playing the piano, singing the same song that now bound them together. She spoke of the final day, when Laura held her hand and whispered, "Don't let my son lose himself." That was the promise Ruth had made, and kept. The millionaire, overcome with emotion, could no longer hold back his tears. The song that had once been only a memory was now a living vow. Suddenly, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Richard Coleman appeared, tense, his expression cold and commanding. His eyes shifted between his son and the maid. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice sharp as glass. Ruth said nothing. Ethan, eyes red with tears, met his father's gaze without fear. Richard understood enough, and with a cruel finality said, "You're fired." "Right now." Ruth didn't protest. She gathered her cleaning cloth and bucket, her posture straight, her dignity intact. Before leaving, she turned to Ethan and said calmly, "Nothing that's true can ever be lost, not even when power tries to hide it." The millionaire stood frozen, his soul torn between anger and grief. And as the door closed behind her, he knew that something inside him had been taken, but somewhere deep within, a new seed had begun to grow. Ruth Harris left the mansion without looking back. The morning sun reflected off the marble steps, and the distant sound of the gates closing felt like the end of a chapter. Ethan Coleman stood frozen, watching as the figure of the maid disappeared beyond the iron gates. There was dignity in every step she took, a quiet strength he had never understood until that moment. The millionaire felt for the first time what it meant to lose something money could never buy. Inside the house, silence weighed heavy. Richard Coleman pretended to move on with his day as if nothing had happened, but tension lingered in every corner. Ethan tried to speak, but his words got lost between anger and fear. His father looked at him with icy disdain and said, "She was just an employee, nothing more." Ethan said nothing. He only felt a knot tightening in his chest. In that moment, he realized his father hadn't spoken of love in years. The following days were a blur of emptiness and memory. Ruth's song seemed to echo through the corridors long after she was gone. Ethan, the millionaire who had grown up surrounded by excess, now found himself surrounded by silence. The mansion, filled with art and crystal, felt like an even bigger prison. He shut himself in his room, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand why a simple maid had shaken him so deeply. The answer would come, painfully and in time. Richard, impatient, kept demanding results. "You're a failure, Ethan," he barked over breakfast. "You can't lead. You can't live up to the Coleman name." Each word hit like a blade. The young man tried to defend himself, but his father's pride was impenetrable. The pressure grew unbearable, and when word of another scandal reached the press, Richard finally lost control. That night, the inevitable confrontation came. Ethan stormed into the office, eyes burning with anger. "Everything I've ever done was to please you, and it was never enough," he shouted. Richard rose from his chair, calm and cold. "You're not worthy of my name," he said. The silence that followed was deafening. Then the father pointed toward the door and uttered the words that would never leave Ethan's mind. "Get out of my house. Now." Ethan said nothing. He grabbed a backpack and left. The night wind stung his face, and every step took him farther from the world he knew. The millionaire heir was now alone. No money, no home, no direction. What had once been privilege had turned into punishment. As he walked through the glittering streets of Beverly Hills, the shop windows seemed to mock his fall. Hours later, he sat down on the curb, exhausted. He looked up at the sky and wondered what his mother would say if she saw him like this. The melody returned, and with it Ruth's voice. Sometimes what looks like failure is just a cry for help. For the first time, he understood. Failure wasn't his end, it was an invitation to begin again. But where? And with whom? As dawn painted the sky orange, Ethan kept walking aimlessly. The luxurious streets faded into simpler neighborhoods, where people were already awake, heading to work. Then something familiar reached him. The smell of fresh coffee and the sound of a diner door swinging open. He looked up and froze. There she was, Ruth behind the counter serving with the same serene smile as always. Their eyes met. No words were needed. Everything was understood. The fallen millionaire and the dignified maid faced each other once more, now on equal ground, where gold meant nothing and the heart meant everything. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped toward her, unaware that this was the first step of his redemption. The doorbell chimed as Ethan walked in. The smell of fresh coffee and warm bread filled the air, clashing with the emptiness he carried inside. The diner was simple: wooden counters, small tables, and large windows letting in the soft morning light. Behind the counter stood Ruth Harris, the maid who had once worked in the mansion, now moving with quiet confidence, as if this place had always been where she belonged. She saw him, but didn't look surprised. Time seemed to pause between them, as if fate had simply been waiting for this reunion. Ethan, the millionaire who had lost everything, hesitated at the doorway. Ruth's old green uniform had been replaced by a red apron, yet her presence carried the same calm dignity as before. With a gentle nod, she invited him to sit. There was no judgment in her eyes, only acceptance. Ethan chose a table by the window and watched people come and go. Workers chatted about bills, families, and ordinary dreams. Everything here felt real, so different from the polished falseness of the world he'd known. When Ruth placed a cup of coffee before him, the aroma stirred something deep inside, the forgotten taste of simplicity. The maid didn't need to speak. Her gesture said everything. "I have nowhere to go," Ethan confessed, staring into the cup. Ruth leaned slightly forward, her hands resting on the counter. "Then this is where you start again," she said softly, with the same calm she once used to polish marble floors. Her words carried the quiet power of forgiveness. For the first time, the millionaire felt like he could breathe. In the days that followed, Ethan began working there. He wiped tables, cleared plates, and helped in the kitchen under Ruth's watchful eye. At first, his hands trembled. He had never held a broom before. But little by little, he found peace in the rhythm of honest work. The chatter of the diner became the soundtrack of a new life, and humility, once foreign to him, started to feel like home. Customers often glanced curiously at the polite young man in simple clothes. No one knew he had once been a millionaire, and he didn't bother to explain. Ruth, observing quietly, saw a new man taking shape, one molded not by wealth but by character. She guided him without words, teaching through small gestures. A thank you, a good morning, a genuine smile. That was where Ethan met Emma Davis, the waitress with kind eyes and a bright smile. Young and hardworking, she dreamed of becoming a teacher. She treated Ethan like any other coworker, with warmth, not awe. When he stumbled carrying trays, she laughed and helped him. And slowly that laughter began to heal parts of him that even time had failed to reach. Day by day, the diner began to feel like a family. Ruth watched the two of them with the calm knowing of someone who'd already seen life's patterns unfold. The maid, now a silent mentor, witnessed the arrogant boy grow into a man. Each small act of serving coffee, cleaning a table, listening to a story, was a brick in Ethan's rebuilding. One night, after everyone had gone home, Ethan stayed behind at the counter, counting the day's earnings. It wasn't much, but it was the first money he had ever earned with his own hands. He smiled as he realized the meaning behind it. Outside, the reflection of the flickering "open" sign glowed on the glass, a quiet reminder that some doors only open once others have closed. The diner's routine began shaping Ethan Coleman in ways he never imagined. The millionaire who was once used to galas now wiped tables, washed dishes, and learned to serve customers with a genuine smile. At first, each task felt like punishment, but slowly it became a mirror, reflecting what he had always needed to be: useful. Ruth Harris, the maid he had once looked down upon, now watched his effort with the serene eyes of someone who sees a seed finally sprouting. Ethan started to notice details he had never cared about before. The hiss of the coffee machine, the smell of toasted bread, the soft laughter of Emma Davis. the waitress who somehow found beauty even in the chaos of the morning rush. Everything had rhythm, a cadence of life that money had never taught him. He realized that work wasn't about status but purpose, about being fully present in every gesture. The maid guided him with patience and quiet wisdom. "Work is how you make peace with the world," Ruth would say while teaching him how to mop the floor properly. Ethan, sweating beneath his apron, would listen in silence. Each day, a little more of his pride dissolved, replaced by something new: gratitude. The millionaire was learning to find worth not in what he owned, but in what he did. There was something transforming in seeing the results of his own effort. When he polished the counter until the light reflected on it, he felt a satisfaction he had never known. The same man who once yelled at employees now smiled when a customer said, "Thank you." The diner had become his spiritual workshop, a place where humility was the true gold. Emma watched the changes with quiet affection. Sometimes she saw him helping co-workers without being asked, clearing dishes, listening to stories. She noticed how he laughed at himself when he made mistakes, without the arrogance he once carried. The millionaire who had arrived broken was rebuilding himself through small victories. And amid it all, a genuine friendship was taking root, soft as the smell of fresh coffee. Ruth rarely praised him aloud, but her gaze said everything. There was pride there, the kind a mother has watching her child grow. She knew Ethan still had a long road ahead, but she could see something new inside him, a strength born from regret and the will to do better. "The difference between failure and redemption," she told him once, "is what you choose to do after you fall." He kept those words like a compass. As weeks passed, the millionaire became part of the community. Customers called him by name. Co-workers treated him as an equal. When payday came, he didn't feel shame anymore. He felt honor. It wasn't much, but it was his. Ruth smiled every time she saw him fold the money carefully and tuck it away, as if it were an invisible trophy. One afternoon, while cleaning the counter, Ethan said softly, "You know, Ruth, sometimes I feel like my mother would be proud of me now." She stopped, looked at him, and replied, "She is. She always was. She was just waiting for you to see what was already inside you." Her words echoed in him for the rest of the day. It was as if work had stopped being routine and become a kind of prayer. Life at the diner continued in its gentle rhythm. Ethan grew lighter, and even the air around him seemed different. But destiny, as always, had more to reveal. And on one of those calm nights, Ruth would approach him with a more serious look, carrying a secret that would change everything he thought he knew about his father and about himself. It was late at night in the diner. The lights were off, and only the faint glow of the sign outside shimmered through the windows. Ethan was wiping down the counter when he noticed Ruth standing near the back door, her expression different. No longer the calm, gentle smile he knew, but something heavier, almost solemn. She held a small, worn envelope in her hands. "It's time you learned what I've kept hidden for so long," she said quietly. The millionaire's heart began to race. Ruth stepped closer and set the envelope on the counter. Inside was an old rusted iron key. "This key belongs to your father's office," she explained. "There's a book hidden there. I found it years ago before I was fired." Ethan looked at her, puzzled. "A book?" She nodded slowly. "Records, evidence, secrets that money tried to erase." The air seemed to thicken. The distant hum of traffic faded, and Ethan's breathing grew shallow. He tried to piece together her meaning, but Ruth went on, unwavering. "The Coleman empire was built on lies. Your mother lost everything that was hers, and he never told you the truth." Her words cut through the silence like a blade. The millionaire stepped back, feeling the weight of his last name like a chain tightening around him. Ruth sat down, weary. The maid who once spoke in parables now spoke in plain, piercing truth. "I saw the documents, Ethan, transfers, fraud, forged signatures. Your mother trusted him, and he took everything. That's why she made me promise to look after you. It wasn't just love. It was regret." Ethan lowered his head, his hands trembling against the counter. The memory of his mother returned like a tide. The piano, her laughter, the scent of jasmine. He remembered his father calling her weak, saying she didn't understand business. Now it all made sense, the disdain, the silence, the buried truth. Ruth watched him absorb the shock, her eyes tender yet unflinching. "You had to be strong enough to hear this," she whispered. "Now you are." Ethan took a deep breath. "Why tell me now?" he asked. Ruth gave a tired smile. Because you've changed. The arrogant millionaire died with the life you lost. The man standing here is the one your mother believed in. He swallowed hard, unable to speak. The silence between them felt sacred, like a vow. Outside, the faint sound of rain began to fall against the glass. The maid pushed the envelope back toward him. Before you open that door, remember this. Truth is a double-edged knife. It cuts the other, but it cuts you too. Seek justice, yes, but don't lose yourself to hate. Remember what I taught you. Forgiveness is the only path that doesn't destroy. Ethan nodded slowly, her words echoing through him like a quiet hymn. A cold wind slipped through the crack in the door, dimming the light. Ruth walked to the window and looked at the dark sky. Your mother believed good would always win, she said softly. But sometimes to win, you have to face your own blood. Ethan stepped closer, clutching the key in his fist. I don't want his empire, Ruth, he said. I just want the truth. She turned and smiled faintly. Then you've already won. The rain thickened outside, the streetlights flickering through the glass. Ethan slipped the key into his pocket, his expression firm. The maid watched him quietly, knowing that this decision marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The journey that had started in arrogance was now guided by purpose. And as he walked out into the night, Ruth whispered softly like a prayer, let him choose forgiveness before vengeance. The rain had stopped, but the sky still hung heavy with dark clouds. Ethan Coleman, the weary-hearted millionaire, stood before the gates of the mansion he once called home. The same imposing structure that had once made him feel powerful now loomed like a stranger watching his return. The cold iron beneath his fingers seemed to whisper, nothing here belongs to you anymore. In his pocket, the key given to him by the maid, Ruth Harris, burned like a reminder of what was about to unfold. As he entered, silence swallowed him whole. The cold light reflected off marble floors, and the echo of his footsteps thickened the air. Every portrait, every statue, every polished surface seemed to shout his father's name. Richard Coleman, the man who had taught his son to measure worth in dollars, not dignity. Ethan walked to the office and slid the key into the lock. The metallic click sounded like a verdict being read. Inside, the air smelled of leather and old memories. The office was just as he remembered. Walls lined with books, papers stacked neatly, the scent of expensive cologne still lingering. On the desk sat an old photo of Laura Coleman, his mother, smiling faintly, hauntingly. Ethan opened the locked drawer, and there it was, the ledger. Thick pages filled with numbers, signatures, and names. Every line a confession written in ink. He barely had time to breathe before hearing that cold, familiar voice behind him. I knew you'd come back here. Richard Coleman, the powerful magnate, stood at the door. His suit was immaculate, his posture rigid, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. Here to take what you couldn't earn? He asked, voice sharp as a blade. Ethan turned slowly, clutching the ledger to his chest. No, I came for the truth. The tension between them was palpable. Two generations colliding, one shaped by greed, the other now reborn in humility. Everything you have came from me, Richard barked. Even the shame, Ethan replied. The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. The millionaire, now a man in full, faced the man who made him, not with hatred, but with the quiet strength of someone who finally understood himself. Richard let out a hollow laugh, pacing around the desk. You don't know what it takes to build something from nothing. I did what I had to do. Ethan's voice was calm but unwavering. You destroyed what mattered most, trust. Mom believed in you, and Ruth, she saw it all. The mention of the maid's name made the older man flinch. That woman should have stayed silent. He shouted. Ethan stepped closer. She was the only one brave enough to tell the truth. The air grew heavier. Richard's face reddened as he leaned on the desk, sweat beading on his forehead. Ethan continued steady and clear. I don't want your money. I don't want your empire. I just want you to look at this. He opened the ledger on the table, its pages glowing under the light. This is your legacy, corruption, lies, greed. But there's still time to change. The old man laughed bitterly, but his breathing was uneven, strained. Ruth appeared at the doorway, silent as a shadow. The maid watched the scene unfold, her eyes glistening with both pain and faith. He's not your enemy, Richard, she said softly, but her voice carried weight. He's your mirror. The magnate tried to speak, but the words dissolved into a rasping groan. His body gave out, his hand searching for balance, and in that instant power fell. Ethan caught him before he hit the floor. That embrace, one that had never existed, finally happened on the cold marble ground. Time seemed to stop. Outside, the rain returned, gentle this time, like a prayer. Ruth knelt beside them, holding both their hands. Ethan looked down at his father, fear mixing with peace in his eyes. There was no anger left, only compassion. "It's okay, Dad, I'm here." And as he called for help, Ruth's voice came softly behind him, steady and full of faith. Sometimes God breaks a man only to rebuild him the right way. The rhythmic beeping of hospital machines replaced the sound of rain. Ethan sat beside his father's bed, his eyes fixed on the wires pulsing in time with Richard's shallow breathing. That cold, sterile room felt like a silent altar, the place where pride came to die. The millionaire, now stripped of arrogance, held the hand of the man he once feared. Time hung suspended between guilt and grace. Ruth Harris arrived soon after, the same maid who had witnessed the empire's rise and fall. She wore simple clothes, a worn wool coat, and held a small rosary in her hands. She said nothing, simply placed her other hand over Ethan's and looked at Richard. Her silence spoke louder than any sermon. She was the presence of conscience, steady, patient, and without pride. For 3 days, Ethan slept in an uncomfortable chair, waking to the sounds of nurses passing by. Sometimes Emma appeared with a cup of hot coffee and a few soft words. The waitress, with her gentle smile, brought a quiet light into that room full of sorrow. Ruth came every morning, whispered a prayer, and left without a word. Her faith didn't need recognition, only results. On the third night, when the air felt heavier than usual, Richard opened his eyes. The magnate, once the image of control, and was now just a tired old man. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. Ethan leaned closer and heard him whisper, "I failed you. And her." It was the first time those words had ever crossed the wall he had built around himself. The son said nothing, but tears streamed freely down his face. Ruth stepped closer to the bed, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "He's asking for forgiveness, even if the words won't come out," she said gently. Ethan nodded and replied, his voice trembling, "I know, and I forgive him." Those 3 words changed the air in the room. It felt lighter, sacred, as if years of pain had evaporated. The maid closed her eyes in silent prayer, and Emma quietly wept in the corner. Richard took a deep breath, tears falling from eyes that had once only known pride. "Tell Ruth, I should have listened," he murmured weakly. She moved closer, calm as ever, and said, "What matters is that you're listening now." Their eyes met, the man who had spent a lifetime buying respect, and the woman who earned it through truth. His pride dissolved, and forgiveness settled like a healing balm. Ethan stayed by his father's side through the following nights. There was no anger left, only a love reborn pure and new. Ruth and Emma stood by him silently, steady as pillars of faith. The millionaire who once shouted at the world now spoke softly with tenderness. "He's becoming human again," Ruth said one morning, her smile faint but proud. On the 7th day, Richard woke clearer than before. He looked at his son and whispered, "You've won, Ethan, not for what you have, but for who you've become." Ethan smiled and squeezed his hand. "No, Dad, we won." Ruth wiped a tear from her cheek, and Emma took Ethan's hand. The silence that followed was peaceful, the kind of peace that only comes after a storm. As sunlight poured through the window, warming Richard's face, Ruth whispered, "Mrs. Laura would be proud." Ethan turned to her and smiled. "What you taught me, Ruth, he needed to hear it too." And in that moment, the circle closed. Yet something new began. The realization that forgiveness wasn't the end of the journey, but the beginning of something far greater. I'm past. And Ethan Coleman's life seemed to move to a new rhythm. The man who was once just the son of a millionaire now woke up early, drank coffee from a simple mug, and wore the same old coat every day. The light that surrounded him no longer came from gold, but from the calm gaze of someone who finally understood his own worth. Ruth Harris, the maid who had taught him how to begin again, was now his mentor and closest friend. The diner that had once sheltered his humility had become the heart of something greater. Ethan began to dream of a project that would unite work and dignity, a place where people without opportunity could find not only jobs, but purpose. "What you've learned should serve more than just you," Ruth had told him. He understood then that this would be his way of honoring the past. With help from Emma Davis, the waitress who had loved him quietly, Ethan started turning the dream into reality. They rented a small warehouse, scrubbed the floors with their own hands, and hung a simple wooden sign on the wall, the Laura Coleman Renewal Center. His mother's name, carved in wood, seemed to bless the space. Every brick represented forgiveness and every table a new chance at life. The maid watched it all with tears in her eyes. "Never thought I'd live to see this," Ruth said, wiping her face with the same cleaning cloth she still carried in her pocket, like a piece of her past. Ethan smiled. "None of this would exist without you." She shook her head and replied, "Gold might shine, boy, but only the heart can illuminate." He never forgot those words. Emma, for her part, watched the project grow like a sunrise. People arrived timid and hopeless but left smiling, full of renewed purpose. Ethan led the activities, teaching simple skills, furniture repair, cooking, budgeting. The millionaire who once couldn't listen now inspired others with stories of failure and rebirth. Each week, more volunteers joined. Ruth trained new cleaning staff with her usual maternal patience, reminding them that cleaning wasn't just for the floors, it was for the soul. "A clean floor is just the start. The rest is getting your heart in order." Her words spread through the center like a soft fragrance. Emma, beside Ethan, organized night classes for young students chasing their dreams. One afternoon, during the center's official opening, Ethan stepped onto a small makeshift stage. He wore simple clothes, his hair tucked behind his ear, and held a microphone with trembling hands. Behind him, a mural displayed photos of everyone who had helped on the journey, including Ruth and his late mother, Laura. "This place is for those who've fallen and chosen to rise again," he said. "And it's dedicated to two women who taught me what love truly means." Ruth, sitting in the front row, watched him with a mix of pride and serenity. Emma's eyes glistened with tears and the audience rose to their feet in applause. It wasn't just a speech. It was the healing of a wound that had spanned generations. The millionaire who once chased power now spread hope, and behind him the maid who had guided him through darkness smiled quietly, the light shimmering in her eyes. When the ceremony ended, Ethan turned to Ruth and said, "You saved me, and now I want to save others." She answered with the calm wisdom of someone who had watched life change more than once. "Then keep the promise you made, to your mother, and to your own heart." He nodded with a soft smile, but behind her calm gaze, Ruth's eyes already held a distant glimmer, as if she knew her time in this world was gently coming to an end. The years flowed gently, and time began to draw its quiet marks across Ruth Harris's face. Her hair, now almost entirely gray, gleamed like silver under the morning light. The maid who once carried buckets and mops through marble halls now walked slowly but steadily through the corridors of the Laura Coleman Center. People still called her Miss Ruth, and the respect she inspired was worth more than any fortune a millionaire could boast. Ethan often watched her from a distance, always with the same look of gratitude. Sometimes he'd pause his work just to listen as she spoke to someone, sharing an old story or offering a piece of advice that sounded like poetry. Ruth's wisdom seemed to come from another age, a blend of faith and experience that couldn't be learned from books, only from life. "The heart," she used to say with a soft smile, "is the only place where time has no authority." One morning, Ethan noticed Ruth seemed weaker. She sat down more often, breathing slowly, her gaze lingering on the center's garden. "Are you all right, Miss Ruth?" he asked, worried. She smiled gently. "I'm just learning how to rest, boy. After teaching for so long, the body asks for peace." Ethan laughed softly, trying to hide the quiet fear that crept into his chest. Emma noticed it too. She brought Ruth hot tea and warm blankets whenever she could. "You should see a doctor," she'd insist. But Ruth would shake her head with serene conviction. "The only doctor I need is time. It knows what it's doing." Then she'd turn her gaze back to the horizon where the sun dipped behind the trees. There was a quiet shimmer in her eyes, the kind of farewell that only those who truly love can understand. One chilly afternoon, Ethan found her sitting on a garden bench watching the flowers fade with the season. He sat beside her in silence. Ruth kept her eyes on the sky and began to speak softly. "You forgave, Ethan, and that's why you won. Forgiveness is the greatest wealth a man can own. Money disappears, power changes hands, but a clean heart that can never be taken. Ethan said nothing, but his soul absorbed every word. She continued, "You know, boy, the world is tired of people who want to win. What it needs is people who want to serve." Ethan took a deep breath and replied, "You've always served, and you've won." Ruth smiled, humble as ever. "I only did what I promised your mother, and now I see that I've fulfilled it." He lowered his head, eyes glistening. The wind blew gently, scattering petals across the ground, as if time itself was bowing in reverence. That night, Emma helped Ruth to bed. The maid took her hand and whispered, "Take care of him when I no longer can. He's strong, but his heart is still tender." Emma nodded, tears in her eyes. Ruth smiled faintly and added, "And remember, love is the only inheritance worth leaving behind." It was the last time her voice filled that room. The following days were filled with silence and gratitude. Ethan walked through the center's halls and felt her presence everywhere, in the shine of the windows, in the scent of freshly cleaned floors, in the faint hum of an old song that seemed to come from nowhere. The millionaire understood then that death isn't absence and it's transformation. Ruth hadn't gone. She had simply spread herself across everything. One morning he found a folded sheet of paper on his desk, written in her delicate handwriting. It was a note, short and true. "Keep helping those no one sees. Humility is the secret that changes the world." Ethan read it as if reciting a prayer, and as he looked up, sunlight streamed through the window. The same golden light Ruth had always loved. Something deep inside him whispered that this was not the end, but the beginning of something eternal. Years passed, yet time seemed to slow down for Ethan Coleman. The millionaire who once lived surrounded by luxury now walked barefoot through the garden of a community center. The same place born of tears and second chances now bloomed with colors and laughter. Children ran between benches, workers shared meals, and the soft sound of a piano echoed in the background, the same melody his mother, Laura, used to play. Ethan stopped in front of a small grave covered in wildflowers. On the simple marble was engraved, "Ruth Harris. Gold may shine, but only the heart can illuminate." He knelt, placing a bouquet and a folded note beside it. On the paper were the words she had written years ago. "Humility is the secret that changes the world." The wind blew gently, moving the paper as if Ruth were still there. Whispering wisdom into his ear, Emma Davis, now his wife, approached with a serene smile. In her arms she carried their eldest son, Daniel, a 6-year-old boy with bright, curious eyes and an eager heart. "Dad, is this the lady who taught you to be good?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. Ethan smiled, brushing a lock of hair from the boy's forehead. "Yes, son. The maid who cleaned floors and also cleaned my heart." The boy knelt to touch the flowers on the grave. "Is she in heaven?" he asked. Emma's voice was soft. "Yes, but she's also here, in everything your father does." Daniel nodded, then ran off, laughing through the garden. Ethan watched him go, eyes misty, seeing in the boy the same spark Ruth had once seen in him, proof that goodness multiplies when passed on with love. The community center had become a living symbol of the legacy of two women: Laura, the mother who believed in love, and Ruth, the woman who taught forgiveness. On the walls, colorful murals told stories of hope and renewal. People of all ages came and went, carrying the dignity of those who had rediscovered their worth. The millionaire who once worshipped wealth was now rich in faith, gratitude, and purpose. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Ethan sat on the same bench where Ruth used to rest. The wind moved gently through the trees as if time itself embraced him. He closed his eyes, and for a moment he heard her voice again. "Don't forget, boy, what matters isn't what you have, but what you give." A quiet tear rolled down his cheek, warm and sweet. Emma walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "She'd be proud of you," she said softly. Ethan looked toward the horizon. "She taught me to be free," he replied. The sunlight reflected in his eyes, and for a fleeting instant, it felt as though Ruth was there, unseen, yet present in every ray of light, every humble gesture, every life changed by love. Daniel ran back, holding a small flower. "Dad, look!" This one grew right next to her name. Ethan took the flower gently, looked at the grave, and smiled. "She's still teaching us, son," the boy laughed. And together they walked hand in hand through the garden, beneath the same golden sky that had once witnessed their pain, forgiveness, and rebirth. The camera slowly pulled back, revealing the entire center bathed in the light of sunset. The voices of the people blended with the soft piano melody, the same tune that began it all. On the building's front wall, a sign gleamed gently. Laura Coleman Renewal Center, where love begins again. And in the whispering wind that passed through the trees, one final truth could almost be heard. Forgiveness isn't the end. It's the beginning of all true love. In the end, the true secret Ruth Harris taught Ethan Coleman wasn't in her words, but in her example. The maid showed that power doesn't lie in having, but in being honest, being grateful, being human. The millionaire, who once chased approval and wealth, discovered that the greatest luxury in life is the ability to forgive and start over. And maybe that's the lesson we all need to remember. Life doesn't change when we accumulate things, but when we learn to serve with heart. So if this story touched you, if you saw yourself in Ethan, in Ruth, or even in Emma, don't let this message end here. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and keep following stories that inspire, heal, and transform. Because deep down, we all have a little maid within us, someone who, even in silence, tries to clean and protect the best parts of our own heart.